Thank you very much for tuning into the Dallas Design Sprints podcast. My name is Robert Scrobe. On today's show, we're going to be featuring David Todd. He's a coach, consultant, and design sprint facilitator based out of Toledo, Ohio. On the show, we get a little bit into design sprints, what he was doing before he moved from Portland, Oregon, and what he's looking forward to in 2019. Hope you enjoy the show, and we'll see you on the other side. David Todd, thank you very much for coming on to the Dallas Design Sprints podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we met through the November virtual design sprint that you signed up for or was a part of. I believe you were on the team that did the design sprint referral network, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Now,
Team C.
Team C, yeah. Mm-hmm. What was your overall impression of that entire experience? Because if I recall correctly, you had other work obligations, so you came in when you could because it was a volunteer effort. What were your impressions of that overall experience?
The first thing that comes to mind is how many hats you wore and how many pieces you held to help that stay afloat and have momentum forward. That was very clear, all the structure that you had to put in place.
I was a crazy person.
Yeah, you really went above and beyond. And really, I don't think we would have gotten to Friday to a prototype that we could test without that. Even though other people, have strong skill sets and experience, and Douglas and Benoit and the others and Richard, who was there, and then a couple others were there briefly, but also had other obligations. And because of all that, I think without your framework and structure and prep work, and then also just integral, like co-facilitating with Douglas, I think we couldn't have gotten to the prototype that we could actually test. So that's my lasting impression, was just, how much you had to hold. So it makes me think going forward in virtual design sprints of whether or not that is always a two-person job, what you held and what Douglas held, or how to distribute those pieces.
I think the example with the virtual design sprint was one where there was a lot of structure added to it. If you were facilitating on your own in a virtual environment, you probably would have a lot more on your plate. But my aim was to try to make it so, in lieu of viewing the engagement as being a lot of work, a lot of that facilitation and structure around the process and the deliverables was kind of done for participants, so you could more or less experience what it was like. Now, you've recently become, were certified by AJ and Smart in design sprint facilitation. Given your impression of what you learned in that class, how did that differ or was similar to what you experienced in November with the virtual design sprint?
Well, it mapped pretty closely, with a few exceptions just based on schedule logistics. And I would say it also met my expectations of, hearing cases where it's hard to get everyone in the room at the same time, and just understanding time constraints of when you're trying to gather cross-functional teams. And in our case, just gathering remote teams with varying levels of commitment to the work, or just sheer availability to the work. So I think just getting a real live example of what that's like, to have people touch in for a half hour and then miss a 3-hour segment, or the other way around, of having to duck out early and having to catch up the following day. So that all felt like the things that I had been prepared for and heard about, and it gives me some food for thought in terms of planning and how to get people present, and other mechanisms might support virtual work and having people really be committed and present for the work.
What attracted you to the design sprint process in the first place? I mean, what prompted you to, put your money down for a masterclass certification in the process?
Well, I actually coach and consult more on a personal level, personal growth with business leaders. And I find myself also using modalities that get into more organizational design and change management, and designing new systems for them or with them. And it was just kind of perfect timing of kind of that intuitive Googling and searching and roaming around and kind of going down different rabbit holes that get at where people are doing innovative things in complex collaborative environments.
So how do you see yourself applying the process in your own work going forward?
I do see myself using design sprints and adaptations of it, whether it's lightning design or decision jam type of format just for quick processes with teams, with leaders. I see it more just given who I work with around organizational decisions, as opposed to what we are focusing on where it may manifest as a digital product that people interact with and utilize. So that's more where I'm curious about it, and where I haven't worked. And I just moved cross country from Portland, Oregon to Toledo, Ohio, and I was in a very small business centric environment, and I worked with a lot of small business owners. And now I am just meeting more people in bigger corporate environments where I am. So I have some curiosity and I want to add to my tool belt in terms of what I can bring to leaders in those organizations where they do have to deal with greater complexity in a corporate environment, as opposed to working with a founder of a company that may have 10 employees scaling to 30 employees or 70 employees. And what he faces is very different from the people who I'm meeting right now in my new community.
Do you see this process kind of blending in with other tools and processes that you currently employ as part of your coaching and consulting?
Yes, and actually it's something that's kind of on my plate right now, is looking at case studies and trying to see how others have woven it in to fuel that for me. I can see it just evolving out of a relationship with a leader and seeing that continual challenges arise, and just adding it to a proposal where I may be going into other modalities and tools I used in the past and see this as a way of aligning and testing which path to go forward with. And do just that to create these, the minimum viable experience or opportunity to learn and test which way to go forward. Whereas before, I didn't have that type of structured experience to offer that would give that type of data to inform those decisions. So,
how many people are involved with your business? Are you a solopreneur? Do you have like a staff? Do you have like extended consultants that work with you? What's your makeup right now?
I'm solo.
You've been doing it for quite a long time, from what I gather.
About 5 years in the current role that I'm in, and it's been a solo business, with the exception of intermittent and occasional collaborations with. I do a lot of group work also that really doesn't interact with corporations. It's more around personal development, and with those, I've co-facilitated with my wife for one, and also with another partner back in Portland. And now we're seeking ways to collaborate virtually and facilitate similar groups, but remote, as opposed to the in-person experience that we were creating over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. I just think remote's going to be the next big thing. It's been gradually and slowly, organically growing in awareness and acceptance, whether it's been headlines or it's been just a friend of a friend being in a virtual environment. More and more evidence seems to suggest that this is just going to move forward, and eventually it'll hit that peak where it just kind of zooms into significance.
I'm feeling that. Yeah.
So with your, I guess I'm curious now. What is it like to work with you? What do you bring to the table that makes your coaching consulting unique, or it's how have you kind of marketed what you do?
Well, I was fortunate to be in a small business community, and I previously had a real estate business and had a lot of existing relationships from that segued into a word of mouth business. So I did not market. So I don't have that to share, other than just reputation and on the coattails of a prior business and a level of trust I had in my community that I was able to work with clients based on that, even though I was pivoting into a different role.
And what do people say about you when they personally refer you to someone else as like, David, this guy David, he does this. What do they usually say about you?
I hear things about seeing things in new ways and being able to quickly zoom out and zoom in. And zoom out, I do a lot of systemic work and looking at things through different levels of a system and helping people see themselves more clearly and how they're embedded or entangled or supported by their systems in their world. And how strong those relationships are, and then zooming in from a system to even interpersonal neurobiology about what it's like to be with you if you're a manager and you're talking to an employee or a partner, and how you're perceived and how well you communicate together, and zooming into that kind of co-regulating two-person relationship experience, really drilling down to what it's like when you get nervous talking to your business partner. And that gets beyond just that relational lens and even into the embodied lens of the somatics of what's happening in you, and being able to zoom right into the moment of when a tough decision comes up and something needs to be communicated. What's your default mode, and what else is available? How can we make more options available to you so you can really do what you need to do and what you deeply want to do in those tough moments in relationships, in service to that bigger system. So it's that kind of zooming way into this really kind of intimate personal moment that only that person can know about what's going on inside them and how that impacts their relationship and their system, and kind of zooming back out and seeing how those little adjustments and things we can learn for new capacities can impact bigger systems and relationships. So that's more the nature of the work, of what it has been. And I could see in those moments when we just come to those things, there's clarity about the path and direction, and the body's in line, the relationships are there. And now it just takes tough collaborating to get there. That's where I want to segue into being able to implement some form of sprint, whether it's a process development sprint, organizational design sprint, or new systems for their business sprint.
So you're already thinking about how you can take this process and retrofit it for what you want to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a tinkerer. Yeah.
I never would have pegged you as one, but but to be honest with you, I see this everywhere. And I used to think, I had the impression that it was an audience that had done a few design sprints, was familiar with it, and then decided, okay, now that I know the system, I can go ahead and break it apart and piece it together. But your example is similar to a couple of I've seen recently, where once they get an impression, or once you get an impression of what the process is like, it's all bets are off, especially when you want to bring them into things like digital product design, operational design, learning systems, organizational development, the zoom in, zoom out concept that you're talking about with personal and professional growth. Have you written or published anything around your thoughts around how the design sprint process can merge with all of those?
Not to date, other than extensive Evernote notes to myself that seem to be leading towards something. But
you gotta surface that. You don't have to wait till it's completely ready. I'd love to hear kind of hear what you're thinking about.
Well, thanks for that nudge, and I appreciate that, because it is just under the surface, to use that language. And
I'll be your ghostwriter, David. You don't have to keep it under wraps. So basically, you can tease it out on Twitter or Instagram or something, and then get some interest and kind of go from there.
All right. Yeah, I appreciate that also, because I don't think about how to leverage these other media. So I appreciate that too.
So if you were to show me some of your ideas in your Evernote notes, that there are some highlights, what are some things you've been thinking about? Even though they're unfinished, I like to respectfully ask if there are some particular ideas that you've been circling around that would be kind of good to kind of have a conversation about in this podcast.
Well, one of the things I'm curious about is how this organizationally can be deployed and skills can be taught within organizations for inclusion and diversity, and whichever language organizations land on for that. It's one of the things I appreciate also being I was a teacher in a past life, and wanting to hear all the voices in the room, and this notion of working together alone, and everyone gets a stack of sticky notes and everyone gets represented on the wall. And the power of that for those who may be introverted and have amazing ideas and never quite have the same other social skills that get their voices in the room, that this feels really powerful to me. So I guess I do have some curiosity about the lived experience of that, about people who do find more engagement and empowerment in the workplace where this is being used, and how this can then be taught in organizations to use it to really have greater engagement across all levels. Even if it's just segments of the design sprint process, I like that aspect. So I think about that. Let's see. There's some others. I'm also curious about, I have an interest in, I'm not trained in appreciative inquiry, but I've read it a great deal. And also my coach's training also seems informed by appreciative inquiry kind of models of the questions you ask are kind of create the future you live into. And the conversations you have create the world you live into. So what kind of questions you ask matter. And I think about the questions that are asked in the design sprint and just wonder how those can be tweaked over time, and also just improvised in the moment to elicit, what really brings life to this team or this community or this decision-making process they're going through. Not to just sugarcoat and put a shine on things, but to add that to the conversation, even though it has some leanings towards that already cooked into it. I would look at ways to develop that aspect further.
There's an interesting piece on LinkedIn by John Maeda about, I think the video is called Know Who You're Designing For. And it's actually part of a series where he talks about inclusion, but it's more or less in the design world. And when you were talking about inclusion before and bringing in different people in an organization, that was front and center on the same topic you're thinking that you're describing, is being able to have not necessarily empathy, but to understand where people are coming from a design perspective, and understand that you're dealing with human beings, not necessarily with data. So you really have to go out and understand what they're experiencing, where they are, what they're exposed to, and how to put that greater picture into focus, kind of like what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Can you say his name again?
Yeah, it's John Maeda. His last name is Maeda.
Okay. Great, thank you.
No problem. In fact, I used his material when I was trying to get my previous employer's user experience design group out of using personas, which is a whole different topic for me, because I do not believe they're effective at all. And this is over 2 decades worth of user experience and usability and human factors work. Especially in this day and age, there's just too many touch points with actual physical human beings to use a proxy like a user archetype, like a persona, to really to gain insights. And I think the only application I'm seeing where it makes sense is in voice. So if you want to create like a user archetype that is supposed to represent like Alexa, or is supposed to represent some sort of digital imprint of an entity that you're conversing with on a voice platform, then probably you could, if it helps translate what it is to somebody else. But whole by and large, personas, and this is just me standing on a soapbox, they're a very convenient excuse for a user experience team that's not doing their job. Because you can't do user experience if there are no users. If you're looking at analytics, that's not understanding the user. It's not going to them and figuring out what their problems are, and if your designs are actually solving for them. And anytime I see anyone using personas in enterprise environments or otherwise, I just know that that's an Achilles heel that's going to bury them, especially when it comes
Hmm.
to uh, showcasing how user experience affects the bottom line, affects revenue, market impact, all of that.
Hmm.
So there's that. But
And
I
do
think
you
overall,
find the user interviews just have way more nuance and direct contact with users to replace that?
I do. I also think that, especially with the design sprint process,
Hmm.
there's the default stamp is to use one person per interview. I found that I try to advocate for two at the same time, especially if they know each other, because what happens is that you may not necessarily get through all the 20 or 30 questions that you have lined up for them, but what you do get is nuances about what you're getting feedback on that necessarily wouldn't have surfaced um, without that conversation going back and forth, especially if they're reminding each other of
Yeah.
something that they forget. Um, I I usually try to, especially with new projects and new features, uh, there's the notion that the buyer or the customer is a certain like customer audience, and there's marketing around that. They know all of the age group, the how much income they have, and everything else. And I understand the whole notion about pigeonholing and going after like one or two people and having them represent the greater group.
Hmm.
But in all fairness, if you can't if you can't generate interest in people going, when is this going to be out? Uh, you're really you're really marketing and building for what would you say, a fictional kind of group that
Yeah.
may or may not react appropriately to what you're designing for.
Yeah. I could see how what you're saying. I would probably, it makes me want to tweak, even the process of gaining user testers and wanting to know who else they recommend we interview, peers of theirs who would be good to also, yeah, to have that collaborative and multiple viewpoints and that kind of natural flow of, you kind of simulate kind of cafe talk or whatever you would call it, where just people are prompting each other and, drawing out things that probably does more closely replicate what's happening if you were to launch something and then people start buzzing about it and griping or praising it. And yeah, I could see that being really helpful.
I was listening to a podcast this morning about, I forget his name. He's the person that created Fathom Analytics, and that whole product line was created off of a tweet. So literally, it was like a minimum viable idea, and already had an audience of like 20,000 followers, what have you. But he tested the idea with a small audience, then started posting screenshots of things that he was creating. I think in XD, and he hadn't built the thing. He was just essentially seeing the reactions of what people were doing. And based off of that and based on their direction, he started getting the foundations for what he was building. Whereas if you, on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you kind of put everything in a kind of a bottle in an enclosed environment and try to figure it out there, you don't get that exposure to the market or to the people that are gonna,
Yeah.
with no filter, are gonna say whether or not it works. Which kind of leads me in a question for you is, how do you like to learn? Well, what's your preferred style of learning?
Hmm. I definitely, by experience, that's why I so quickly jumped into what you were offering with the pilot virtual design sprint. That's definitely big for me. Uh, and I read quite a bit, a little bit of video watching in terms of learning, if that's what you're asking about, other modes of learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I just usually follow my natural curiosity, and I'm not afraid to reach out to people who I'm curious about. And that's usually good learning for me.
If
For
we were
those,
to oh, go ahead, keep going.
I just have found, even in past businesses, that people are generally pretty open to genuine curiosity. And if I know I'm coming from a place that's not building with ulterior motives, I just have something I'm really curious about, but I'm usually met with openness. So fortunately, I've learned a lot through other people, other business owners, and just other people in general, across all different types of industries, knowledges, skill bases. So I think just interpersonal learning has also been huge for me.
And historically, have you ever written about those experiences? Have you ever communicated what you've learned or your perspective on things?
No, but I've mentored a number of people and often advocate for that type of learning. But no, so it's just been off the cuff as it comes up, share that experience where it seems like something that would benefit someone's learning.
Part of what we're doing in April with the next version of the virtual design sprint is an experimental track where people can take the design sprint process and merge it with other things that they think would potentially work. And it doesn't have to be a full 4 to 5 day involvement. It could be like 2 hours, half a day, something like that. This was manifested through a couple of requests to have that ability to just take part of the design sprint and experiment with a larger group online, and really, like you're saying before, just to execute and try it out.
Yeah.
If we do that in April, based on your own notes and what you're thinking about piecing together with the design sprint, what could you hypothetically bring to the table as, here's what I'd like to try out?
Well, I think, again, if not knowing what the actual challenge is that someone was trying to run through in an experimental way and collaborate in a different way, I'm not totally sure, but I think leading back on those question forms and what questions the groups are asking and how that may glean different tone to their answers and direction and overall experience. I'm a little curious to test out other question forms.
If you had the ability to generate your own challenge, like if it wasn't necessarily you were going to apply your process to an existing challenge, but one you created for yourself, what would be the challenge / process pairing you would like to choose if you had the option to? You're on the spot, and
yeah.
You have to do it in April no matter what.
Well, for some reason, my mind goes to school. I think it's because we're exploring school options for my daughter. So if I were to look at, and I have a history as a teacher and a master's in education, so just puzzling over how people develop and learn. So looking at public schools, I'm curious about what type of kind of disruption, intervention, reorganization, or from an organizational design standpoint, like what other ways can you impact education?
So I can offer you something that I did recently. You may not have seen it. We did a lightning decision jam with my son's school where they had a parent staff conference. And historically, those have been very boring, not to be they were. It was one-to-many distribution of information. There wasn't a lot of any parent feedback was couched in what the school wanted to hear. And I saw an opportunity to use this process so that it cut out all that useless conversation and really got down to brass tacks about what both camps were interested in. So how might we that we posed was how might both parents and staff work together better in 2019? And I only actually had 35 minutes to get it done, but at the end of it, there was palpable energy in there. And we had 3 items that we moved forward with in the next 30 days, one of which I'm working on this week, which is doing a feature story of a family in the blog for a family that wants to be known about what they do. And it's really like a USA Today kind of insert, but it's a start. Other ideas were a 5 to 10 minute introduction of a family at the very beginning of the meeting. And someone else is organizing a potluck in January for all the family members to come and kind of go over to a person's house. So that would be my example. I would submit as like a way of, if a school is open to it, kind of getting everyone on the same page around the needs and goals of each camp, and then putting that into a bouillabaisse, so to speak, and seeing what comes out.
Yeah. That's great. And that sounds like that was it one classroom at one teacher and whoever parents were able to be present?
So this was an Acton Academy school. So it was a much smaller staff. It wasn't, due to previous engagements, there was like about 12 to 14 people that showed up when real estate could have been 30, but it was because of those previous impressions of the event that there was a lower turnout. But yeah, it was staff and it was parents primarily across the board. Anyone was pretty much open to come.
Mm-hmm.
But in your case of your school, I imagine it's going to have to be one or two people that can act as the, what would you say, the advocates for approaching it in a way so that there's clear benefit to trying a process that you have in mind, especially when it comes to education. And there are other people that I've met that are doing similar things. I don't have the names off the top of my head, but if I remember them, I'll forward them to you if I know that's where your interest is going.
Well, it's definitely one of them. Yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah, on both fronts. And any case studies that you are aware of, I'd be interested in seeing outside of the one you already, just experiment with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's definitely one area.
So if we were to fast forward into 2019, if you and I are talking in mid-December and trying to do some last minute Christmas shopping while we're talking to one another on Amazon, what would be a good year for you, and what would be a stellar year? Something that where you just look back and go, wow, okay, that I didn't expect, but that was amazing.
Yeah, I love that exercise, and it brings out things that were a little quiet in me, but are actually there. And one of which is some experience of working overseas, which it just hasn't been in my view, in my world, and something that dovetails with some family dreams of ours. So some way that this being such an international community of design sprinters, if there's a way that I'm able to do some work overseas, which also leads to some other personal coaching and consulting, I would welcome that. If it leads to us having a stint elsewhere, that would be an amazing year if it included that. And also developing greater capacity and more experience of facilitating online groups. Yeah, collaborating with both my wife and my old partner back in Portland, and seeing those things that we all do in person, gaining more faith in the online community and what experience we can offer despite distance. In the type of content that we go into often is very intimate and used to being handled face to face and shoulder to shoulder, but find that I do think the work can be as effective remotely. So I would love to have a year of multiple experiments and learnings around that.
Is there any place geographically that you would prefer to go? Would it be Europe? Would it be the Asia-Oceania region, South Africa maybe? Where would you like to go?
Right now, following my daughter's impulse, it's Europe. And I have friends in Spain who I'd like to visit, and also, just put myself in a place where I can be mobile and work. But I guess it's Europe for a short answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I have to ask, since I'm originally from Michigan, what compelled you to go to Toledo, Ohio?
My wife's family is here. And our daughter is just leaving a middle school that was very intimate and moving into high school. And it was our one point, kind of transition point in her childhood where we thought we could make a leap. And instead of leaping out into the open, we went to be with her family, where my daughter can go to high school with her cousins. And she's an only child, and having that, I think, was something we wanted to try out have our own prototype and test of that idea. We're in the midst of that right now, and having to be agile and nimble with this whole process.
I hope your daughter never gets wind that she was part of a process. I think the language should be under careful consideration of our options at the time. We felt it was best for our daughter to be around extended family and have a nurturing environment.
Yeah, Thank you. Can I have that soundbite?
I'll put it. Well, I'll have to put it to music, but then you'll have something completely in pocket, so you can.
It's not weird if I play that in her room at night, real quietly, so she.
I wouldn't. Hey, I would not subject my voice to anybody like that FM DJ voice. No. I would feel very strange about that.
Okay.
Although there may be a third act for me if we ever do go into voice and they need voiceovers, then I certainly could find a market somewhere in there. The Velveteen Rabbit, and kind of go down that route.
Yeah, perfect.
Have you checked out any of the? So if you're in Toledo, Ohio, then you're probably fairly close to like Kings Island and Cedar Point and some of the other amusement parks out there.
I'm familiar with Cedar Point. I've not been there. My daughter and wife have been there. My wife went when she was a kid too. So they've both been there at least a couple times.
Yeah, I've gone. I used to go out there all the time. It was a drive from Detroit, but it was all you had to do was a $20 bill. You could get in, and usually when we went, there was no one on the rides. I mean, not like today where there's just like lines and lines and lines and lines.
Yeah.
But you could go on like the really old wooden roller coasters that were clear health violations, and that they could probably kill you at any point. But we had a blast back then. So that's when I saw Toledo, Ohio. It was Toledo, and the second one was like Cedar Point. I remember that place.
Yeah, that's definitely a landmark, and people do come from considerable distances to check out the latest one that they have going on, latest ride.
Well, David, I really appreciate the conversation. Thanks for coming on the podcast, and I wish you all the best next year.
Thank you, Robert. You too.
Thanks again for listening to the Dallas Design Sprints podcast. If you have a question or comment about what you heard on today's show, email me direct at robert@dallasdesignsprints.com. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Pinterest. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.